Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura Hanson with Connect My Brain. And yes, we are. We are always working to connect your brain. So we've been talking about primitive reflexes. What are primitive reflexes? They are reflexes that actually begin during the pregnancy of mom, and they have very important neurological functions that they are going to literally create inside of the womb. They're going to be part of that birth process, and then they're going to go on for a period of time after the baby is born. And some of them can even go into being a toddler. Not a lot, but some of them. And then once you get here, there's another layer of reflexes that begin automatically, and that's the postural reflexes. So I'm focusing right now on the primitives, and today we're actually going to look at Palmar reflex and asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, which is abbreviated ATNR. So the palmar reflex is the one that you put your little finger in the baby's hand and the hand automatically closes. This particular reflex will start 11 weeks in the womb. It will be present at birth, and it is very strong for about the first 12 weeks of life. And then around 4 to 6 months, it's actually going to transform into what we call the pencil grip. So that would be holding a pen or a pencil in your hand, and you are using your index finger, your thumb, and it's balancing on the other 3 fingers. So for the podcast audience, there's a description. If you get a chance and you can go over to our YouTube channel, you'll be able to see that video and you can see me holding a pen in my hand. But in the beginning, it is first the whole hand moving, and then it's going to be the 3 fingers on the ulnar side. So that's the side where your pinky is. And the baby is literally going to use those 3 fingers like a rake. And that's how that early movement is demonstrated in our babies. Now, there's actually a direct link between this particular reflex and the mouth, and specifically sucking. And sucking is a reflex, and it's also how the baby learns how to self-soothe. I am a big advocate for pacifiers because if development is going in the direction that you expect it to, the baby will automatically, at the appropriate time, be able to let the pacifier go. So you can have either extreme with a pacifier. I've heard lots of parents over the years tell me that it looks like the child or baby doesn't like it because every time it tries to suck on the pacifier, it lets it go. And really what's happening is the child cannot latch into the pacifier and literally create that motion of sucking, which would literally lock that pacifier in their mouth. Because it's a reflex, it should be automatic. Now, if there were other issues for the other extreme, that the baby may not want to ever give it up, you're looking at different things. You're looking at things that maybe they're having a hard time self-regulating. It can also be a way that we massage the entire cranial vault. And when you're in the womb, these are pieces. Your skull is in pieces, and they will eventually come together, but they do move throughout your entire life. And this is literally going to create a rhythm of how we pump cerebral spinal fluid throughout the brain and the whole nervous system. So there's lots of important actions that are meant to go on with every little piece of development, and really nothing is meant to be missed. So the Palmar reflex being associated to feeding is in order for the baby to hold mama's breast while they are breastfeeding. They also are creating this neurological loop so that when they begin to feed themselves, they will grab the food and it will automatically go into the mouth. I'm a big advocate as well as to let those babies play with food. Let them get messy. Let them feel the textures. Lots of times, at least I've noticed over the years, there's first-time mommies, they just don't want to get any of the clothes dirty. They always have bibs on the kids and things like that. And it sometimes I think is becoming a little too restrictive when this part of your life is just so much exploration. So I would encourage you to really let that baby get into the food, learn to feed themselves, learn to touch different types of textures so that they're comfortable with all of it. Now, if this reflex doesn't integrate by reduce down 12 weeks and then transform 4 to 6 months, what we might see as a retained reflex is they don't get into the pincer grip. So what would that impact? Learning how to write. And over the years, I've seen lots of messy handwriting. It's also going to impede fine motor control. And it's also going to impede speech because this is a neurological loop, the hand to the mouth. It's part of feeding, but it's also about the development of the mouth. So we're going to talk about the ATNR and the birth process, but let me just kind of jump ahead a little bit. When babies come into this world, they have these beautiful little round heads. And over the first year of life, they're going to actually develop a chin, which is going to change that whole framework of the mouth, as well as the ear. Because when your little cute head is round, the eustachian tube of the ear is horizontal, and it will have an oblique axis by the time you get your chin. So in doing this little series on reflexes, what I'm really trying to help people understand is that development is like a scaffold. You know, you see sometimes these big elaborate scaffolds outside of buildings, and either they're working on something from a construction point of view, or perhaps they're cleaning windows. But, you know, they've literally created this ladder-like process in order to go from either the top to the bottom or vice versa, and everything in between. Well, that's what these reflexes really represent. They lay down what's called central pattern generators. This is way before sensory motor connection. So if we're ever going to get to the root cause of what might be interfering with a child developing, you've got to think about these reflexes. So part of my assessment is actually we look at handwriting, and I get them to write their name. I get them to write their name on a line. I get them to write their alphabet through the middle of a piece of paper so I can just see what is it that their perception is coming forth when the pen or pencil hits that paper. And I get to see how they're holding their writing instrument. And most of the time, those with poor handwriting also do not have a pincer grip, which means that there's the potential that we're also going to see a retained primitive reflex. And this could also interfere with their speech. It could also interfere with the auditory development. And now you can begin to appreciate there's all this different things going on at different times that by the time you get ready to go to school, we just expect that it's all working perfectly, but it may not be. So it's really important that we keep this particular one in mind, but then I'm also going to tie it into what's called the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. And this reflex is also happening in the womb. It's after the hands. So it's around 18 weeks in the womb. This particular reflex, and from now on, I'm going to refer to it as ATNR. This is the kick that mama feels in her belly. So every time you feel a little motion in there, it's this particular reflex. And what's happening is every time that baby turns its head, whatever direction it's turned to, that arm and leg extend out while the other side is flexed. So one side of the body's doing one thing, the other side of the body's doing something else. Now, you may recall that whenever you went in to see either your midwife or your OB, they may have asked you, do you feel the baby moving? So this particular reflex is absolutely responsible for the baby moving inside of the womb. And that movement inside of the womb is responsible for all these connections. Now, I'm going to break down all the connections that are happening with this particular reflex. And as I said before, Palmar was right before it, so they're automatically linked together. And then last time we talked about the Moro reflex. It too is linked to the Palmar and to the ATNR, and I'm going to make that reference to you in just a minute. So the ATNR is all about movement. Now, it's also necessary if mom is able to have a vaginal delivery, the ATNR will actually be part of the birth process. And this is also really important when we're talking about development and then looking at the history of the individual. So when I get histories that talk about cesarean section, or maybe even instrumentation like forceps, then that means that this part of that child's development has been changed. Now, there's no judgment. There's never any judgment, but we've got to realize that if we change what is expected to happen, then we change the outcome. And just because something has become incredibly common doesn't make it right. Now, there are always situations, emergency situations, that there is no other option. And in those particular times, then you have to do what you have to do. But unfortunately, we've done a lot of elective C-sections, planning to have our babies at particular times. In those situations, I would really encourage mamas of babies like that, let's get a developmental assessment. If you're pregnant and you hear this particular podcast, check in with a midwife, check in with your OB. Is there any other possibility for you so that you could work towards a vaginal delivery? There is just so much that goes on during the birth process. I wouldn't want you to miss it. But unfortunately, it does happen. And I understand that. So when we think about the birth process, Babies around 7.5 months are actually going to go from the up position, meaning the head is up, to the head being down in preparation for delivery. There's a lot of things that are going on with bone development and getting that baby's head into the right position so that when the baby is fully matured and the baby is in the right position, the baby actually is going to put a hormone into mama's bloodstream, and that is what's going to have labor commence. Now, when we get the baby into this position, literally the chin will tuck down, the whole cervical spine will straighten out, and the top of the baby's head will actually line up with the mother's pelvic outlet. And now the baby will begin its descent. There's lots of physiological things that are going on during this time, and we actually talked about it when we were doing our podcast on Moro, because Moro is highly responsible for changing the physiological tone of the baby, where Moro activates the sympathetic nervous system, which we know as fight or flight, but it actually at that time is going to slow everything down. And the baby will never respond like this again. It's a very unique moment in the life of that child. So as that baby is slowing down and going through the transition of birth, once the head comes out of the pelvic outlet, ATNR is going to get involved. So now we've got to get the broadest part of our body out, which is going to be our shoulders. So literally in this moment, the baby's head will turn, that arm and leg will extend out, and that's how the baby is going to pull its shoulder underneath the pubic bone. Then the baby will come back to neutral and repeat to the other side. And literally, mama and baby are in this rhythm. And the baby, through this reflex, is literally assisting with contractions, assisting putting that baby into the pathway of getting the head out, thinking of it like a Tootsie Roll coming down with each contraction. So it's very important that the baby get this opportunity to go through, let's look at it as movements. Just as we were talking about before, ATNR is responsible for those neuroconnections. Now, once the baby gets both shoulders out, it's actually going to be the spinal gallant that will assist in the birth of extension. And when we get to spinal gallant, I will highlight what spinal gallant is all about. But let's continue with ATNR. So now really get in your mind's eye what this posture looks like. As the baby turns its head, its arm and legs go out. So the baby at this time is in a flexed position. The fists are very tight. That's Palmar, very tight fisted into its own body. So if I turn my head and that arm and leg go out, that means my arm goes from being close to my chest to full extension, which is about 6 to 8 inches. This is actually the beginning of near-far vision. And during this time, all those other things are going on. Palmar's still going on. The development of the eyes are still going on. The auditory system is still developing. The gut is still maturing. The immune system is still maturing. Everything is in an open window of development. ATNR is responsible for all the different lateral columns of the brain and how they're going to get organized. So you have function on both sides of your brain for different categories. And ATNR is part of that organizational process. So for example, The need to talk is on the right hand side of your brain. The work of talk is on the left. Eventually, it will be both sides communicating to each other in order to have a conversation. So right now, while this reflex is dominating, it's laying down the architect for all these different categories, the different categories of auditory processing, the different categories for immune function. The activation of immune is on the right. The coding and getting ready to launch a more specific attack for any future insult is on the left. But again, it has to get to that point that both sides know how to communicate. So right now, that little baby is processing. That little baby is building. And it has to go through this lateralization of development so that we can make sure that later on, they're going to be organized correctly. So this particular reflex early on is doing near-far vision, lateralization, but it's also ensuring an airway. And, over the years, I've seen so many different points of view when it comes to the safety of our babies early on. These reflexes that I am teaching you about, they have a component for survivability. If you go back and you listen to Moro, arousal, making sure that baby wakes up and feeds every 2.5 to 3 hours. It's the balance of CO2 and O2. If there was too much CO2 in the body, correlated to a baby not being able to get air or suffocating itself in its sheets, this would actually be an under-aroused Moro reflex because Moro and ATNR work together to ensure that that baby always has an airway. This ATNR keeps the baby from ever putting their face into covers, into sheets. And when you put your baby down, that baby will reflexively turn its head. And it is so important that these babies get an opportunity to lay on their back, to lay on their belly, to lay on their sides. Why? Because they still have bone development going on. And bone is going to develop wherever stress is. So wherever you put your baby, either during their waking hours or during their sleeping hours, if they're always on the same part of their head, it's going to be a flattened spot. So if the baby's always on their back when you put them down for rest, then the back of their head will become flat. If you're always putting them in a little carrier, the back of their head will be flat. Or if they just even maybe have one side of the neck too tight, that could even lead to torticollis. Again, think of this scaffold effect. Everything that goes on in that baby's world is literally going to impact their development. But these reflexes are giving you an opportunity to ensure that if they have developed correctly, and if they came in during pregnancy and they're integrating postnatal, this is ensuring that your child will go in the correct direction. So there is literally a connection between the Moro reflex, aka startle, because of its relationship with arousal, sympathetics, and the balance of CO2 and O2, and the reflex of asymmetrical tonic neck reflex in the correlation of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. So again, it is so important for our new parents, or you're getting ready to be a parent, to understand these are signposts that tell you if your child has gone in the right direction. Years ago, I had a family come to me where their little girl was going through about 200 seizures a day. And the child was born by cesarean section. And I listened to the whole thing and I watched the video. The focus from the maternal side and the caregivers was the size of the baby and the color of the baby, which are definitely two good markers. But when they brought the baby over to the table to get cleaned up, the dad, because he had had a child from a previous marriage, he knew that something should happen when I place my finger into my baby's hand. That baby should automatically close their hand. That's Palmar reflex. That is a signpost that while I was in the womb, this reflex came on and I'm born with it and it's functioning. Unfortunately, the father didn't speak up. And by the time they were taking the baby to the baby's area, it started having seizures. Now, I am not saying that it's because of the reflex that the baby had seizures, but perhaps if somebody had paid attention to that reflex in that moment, maybe there would have been some kind of different outcome. We'll never know. But I tell you this because they're signposts. They tell us if things went the right way while that baby was inside of mama. So what else with ATNR? Well, we know it is the kick, the movement. It's part of the birth process. It ensures an airway for that baby. It's the first eye-hand coordination. And then around 6 months, it should be fully integrated. And if it's not, this will interfere with babies getting on their belly and crawling. So crawling is actually when you're motoring around on your belly like a little snake. And creeping is when you actually get up on your hands and knees and begin to push that arm and leg forward, the opposite arm and leg forward. So now try to imagine if this ATNR, get the picture in your mind. If this ATNR, I turn my head and my arm and my leg on that side go out. If it doesn't integrate, how would I do the cross crawl pattern? How would I get both sides of my brain talking to each other? And, just like when we were talking about the survivability, and there was a time when people were so afraid about putting their babies on their belly that everybody just put them down on their back. There was also a significant time that people did not think it was important to crawl. Okay, let's go into the posture. First, you were doing what's called a homolateral movement, same arm, same leg. Crawling and creeping is a opposite arm and leg. So that means that it's my right arm, left leg. That means both sides of my brain. So in a big picture idea only, the right side of the brain controls movement on the right side, and the left side of the brain controls movement on the left side. So if I've got one of each, can you see how it connects both sides of the brain? This is so important because this is the foundation of what that little being crawling and creeping around, eventually getting up on both feet and walking in a cross crawl pattern and being able to use both sides of their brain to do all the different functions that the human brain is able to do. And when I look at a history and I see that maybe the child didn't crawl or creep, maybe the child only did it for a couple of months, you need to be on your hands and knees for about 6 months. And if you got up late, maybe you started crawling, creeping too late. All of these pieces matter in how I build my scaffold from going from brainstem to midbrain to higher brain function. It's a very important reflex. When we assess a child, we do a movement piece to actually look to see the fluidity of their cross-crawl pattern, to actually see if it's there, very fluid. We also look at what's called lateralization. And this is something that you could actually do, and it would help you see if your child's brain was organized during that developmental period. So lateralization is the signpost on the outside of the body that says, I got organized, meaning that my dominant eye, my dominant ear, my dominant hand, my dominant foot should all be on the same side of my body. We do this test readily, and you do it very, very simple. You can use a paper towel roll, a toilet paper roll, place it in front of your child and say, hey, look through that like we're being a pirate on a boat, or you're trying to look at something very far away. And look what they do innately. Don't guide, don't demonstrate. Look at what they do innately. So what hand do they pick it up with? What eye do they put it to? Now place your phone down in front of them and ask them to put the phone up to their ear. You probably already know what hand they write with, and then roll a ball to their foot and see which foot they kick with. If they all went on the same side, terrific. But if they didn't, this is called mixed laterality. And especially if there is still a retained ATNR, this is impeding my ability to cross the midline with my eyes, or it could have impeded my distant vision, because the second half of the year, the first year of life, that second half is when a child is going to be developing their distant vision. Again, can you just see how it all lays on top of each other? And you can't just take one piece out and expect the brain to be able to move in the expected direction. Now, it's a marvelous system. It will figure out a way to adapt. But this is the hard part. This is what is typically happening with our kids, is that they're going through massive adaptation. And that adaptation comes at a cost. And most of the time it shows up when they start school. And it can come out in emotions. It can come out in performance. It can come out in handwriting. It can come out in balance. It can come out to sensitivities in vision and auditory. The list is endless because the outcomes are based on each individual's experience. What was I doing? What was I going through during my developmental windows? And that's why it's not just one size fits all. If you had this problem, every kid has this. I wish it was that simple, but it's not. That's why it is absolutely imperative to understand development. This is what has brought me to the place that I have an incredible assessment, which allows me to see what is it for this individual child. So a retained ATNR is going to literally cause problems with balance, communication on both sides of the brain, homolateral patterns, inability to cross the midline, and you need that with reading. When you are reading, you're reading from left to right, and your optic nerve shares this midline connection. So when we go from left, that is the left part of our temporal optic nerve, and our right side of our optic nerve on the nasal side. And then as you cross the midline, it switches. So that's a huge function. Remember what we were talking about, even with palmar reflex, how it impacts writing. ATNR really impacts vision, but it also impacts writing. Because if that reflex is retained, every time that child goes to try to write, their arm reflexively wants to go out. So they literally sometimes have to lay their head down on the desk in order to write. And because maybe palmar's still going, they may be licking their lips because of the neurological loop between the hands and the mouth. There is so much to these primitive reflexes. And the list is endless. And I still keep learning more every single time I dive into them. I wish it was just this very easy approach. Unfortunately, some places out there are only looking at reflexes from the one that they can see, but they don't understand that if you don't go all the way back, if you don't know how to test for where all of this gets started, you may work on a reflex, but if you didn't go back far enough, eventually they're going to resurface because they're the rudimentary place of all learning, and they're going to cause adaptation again. And you may be going, I just feel like I'm in a cycle where I keep trying different things, but I'm not able to really get to the root of it. Here at Connect My Brain, we get to the root of it. We have a developmental assessment. Our approach is mechanical chemical brain. We could be really good at therapies, but if we don't know how to put this whole thing together, it will keep tripping this individual up, and it'll be very difficult for them to go forward. And their true potential is what's going to be halted. If any of this resonates, reach out, set up a time. We can chat on the phone. It's a complimentary consultation. You can go over to the website, which is connectmybrain.com, and you can send me a request. Please go ahead and add to it, when are you available? It's going to cut down that back and forth. One thing I've noticed when people send in leads, this is the part. We can't get them scheduled because we're going back and forth. Let's cut down that time. Because when you're a kid and you're in an open window of development, time is of the essence, and we need to get our children moving forward. So let me know when you're available. Send me a few days and times that you might be able to schedule a call, and I will do my very best to meet your preferences. I always enjoy reaching out and sharing this information with you. Please also go over to the website and download the show notes. We're also taking the videos and turning them into blogs, which you'll also be able to get on the website. I have a great team that does a lot to help me get this information out, and I am very grateful to them. Marcy, you are a great podcast manager, and Natasha, you do a great job on creating those blogs from the videos. Thanks to my team, and go to that website and download Dr. Hansen's developmental milestones. You're going to see my high points of what I feel like could be some really easy ways for you to pick up those signposts and make sure your child is going in the right direction. Be blessed, take care, and we'll chat again.